We're going to look at Act 1, Scene 1 of Macbeth, and look at the way that the witches are portrayed, and obviously look at the way that Shakespeare introduces evil to the play. The first thing we need to say about the witches is that there are three of them. Three at the time was very much thought of as a magical, evil, supernatural number, and if you look at the way that the witches speak, they take it in turns. So you get the first witch, the second, the third, then you get the first, the second, the third, the first, the second, the third. So they take it in turns and they each speak three times before then finally all speaking in unison together at the end. So Shakespeare's really emphasizing the threeness of it all, the evil nature of these people. The audience at the time would have very much spotted the idea of there being three of them, and that would have been one of the elements that reinforced the idea of the witches being evil. I've even heard that the way in which they would have danced at the time would have been in a sequence of three as well, so even that their movement and their steps would have reinforced that too. The sympathetic background is used, so the references to the thunder and the lightning, look at that in the stage directions, but also in the things that the witches say. Shakespeare is using the weather and the environment here to create that sense of foreboding, to emphasize this idea that these are evil people that you're meeting here. Where they are as well, so they talk about meeting Macbeth on the heath, and in most productions you will find the witches here at this point in a wild location, maybe on the heath, maybe on a beach, but they're not in a town, they're not in a castle. The idea is that they're elsewhere, they're outside, they're beyond civilization, they're on the outskirts of normal society. In that respect, you could call them liminal characters. Gothic texts often contain liminal characters, which means someone on the outskirts, someone on the boundaries. And very much Shakespeare is using their location and the weather to represent them as unnatural and evil, not beings who belong in civilized society. Look also at Act 1, Scene 3, when Banquo first meets them. Look at what he says. He says, "What are these so withered and so wild in their attire that look not like the inhabitants of the earth and yet are on it? Live you, or are you aught that man may question? You seem to understand me, by each at once her choppy finger laying upon her skinny lips. You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so." There's so much that you get out of that, but the main point I think is the idea that Banquo doesn't know quite how to pin them down. He doesn't know quite how to define them. He thinks, well, are you human or aren't you? You look like the inhabitants of the earth, so you look like you're not the inhabitants of the earth, and yet you're on it. I think you're women, but look at those beards. He doesn't know quite who they are or what they are. He doesn't know quite how to place them. And so, again, very much is emphasizing the idea of them being otherworldly and supernatural in that sense. The terms withered and wild very much emphasize that. When the witches speak, one of the things they do is they talk to their cat and their toad. These are called familiars, so kind of like demon-possessed animals. Picture a witch on a broomstick with a black cat on the back. Okay, they're witches' familiars, these kind of sort of demon-possessed animals that they would talk to. Again, it's one more thing that very much represents them as evil. It would have been a sign to the audience at the time that these are beings that we need to be genuinely afraid of here. The way that they spoke would have very much emphasized that too. Most characters in Shakespeare's plays, if they're not speaking in prose, which occasionally they do, most of the time they speak in iambic pentameter, which means there are 10 syllables in every line. And it's an unstressed followed by a stressed syllable. So most characters speak in iambic pentameter, which is very close to the rhythm of everyday speech. You wouldn't necessarily notice if someone was speaking in iambic pentameter that they were even speaking in verse. But you do notice that the witches are speaking in verse. It's very sing-songy, very chant-like. It basically suggests that they're chanting a spell. And the idea of them not speaking in the normal patterns of everyday speech, again, marks them off as different, as unnatural to some extent. So listen to the way that they speak. When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, where the place upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth. There's a real a rhythm and a drive to the way that they're speaking. It doesn't sound like everyday speech. They're using what's called, rather than iambic pentameter, they're speaking in trochaic tetrameter. Okay. There's also lots of rhyme. So look at again and rain. There's rhyme littered through Act 1, Scene 1. Look at fair and air right at the end as well. And obviously there's lots of alliteration right at the end. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and filthy air. Those last couple of lines when it talks about fair is foul and foul is fair, that could be interpreted as good is bad and bad is good. So good is evil and evil is good. So you or I might share whatever our differences, socially, culturally, religiously, we probably share a reasonable amount in terms of our moral code, of our sense of what's right and what's wrong. We probably think that cannibalism is wrong and theft is wrong and so on, whereas kindness and compassion are good things. Okay, whereas the witches say, well, to us, good is bad and bad is good. To the witches, it's the opposite. They're kind of inverting the moral order. To them, good is evil and evil is good. They're completely trying to turn that kind of like sort of moral order or moral compass upside down. They talk in riddles at times. How can fair be foul and foul be good? It doesn't seem to make sense initially, does it? How can the battle be lost and won? It's going to be one or the other, surely. Well, yeah, but they all make sense if you delve into them. But it sounds like they're talking in riddles at times. Another word for this is equivocation, when you deliberately talk in a kind of riddle-like way, but beneath it there is truth. And it's the kind of equivocation that King James would have accused Catholic traitors of indulging in if they were questioned about their Catholic faith. And in fact, there was a Jesuit priest called Henry Garnet, who actually wrote pamphlets encouraging Catholics to equivocate, to kind of present themselves and their faith in such a way that they weren't betraying their faith, but they wouldn't say anything to get themselves into trouble if they were questioned by the authorities at the time. So there's a kind of cultural significance to the witches talking in riddles at this point. They're guilty of the kind of equivocation that King James would have accused Catholic traitors of participating in. If you want to find out a little bit more about Henry Garnet, then if you look at Schmoop, then there's a good little explanation of it there. King James, then, we've mentioned, he was the king at the time in 1606 when the play was first performed, and he was probably at the first performance. It's significant because he wrote a 3-volume book about witchcraft called Demonology, and he very much believed that witches were plotting against him, and that traitors, particularly Catholic traitors who were trying to overthrow him, were probably in league with witches, he believed, in trying to overthrow him. And in fact, the year before, in 1605, there had been the gunpowder plot. And so, James isn't necessarily being paranoid here. There were people plotting to overthrow him. And so the whole theme of the play, in terms of Shakespeare writing about something which is about treason, it's about people plotting regicide, the killing of a king, that very much would have appealed to James' interests and concerns. He would have spent most of his days worrying about people plotting to overthrow him and to kill him. So for Shakespeare to present a play about witches who influence someone to kill the king, it would very much have been a topic that James would have been interested in, but also obviously just genuinely concerned about. The added link here is that James was actually a descendant of Banquo. So if you go back through Banquo and Macbeth and Duncan, they were real people. Shakespeare twists reality a bit in terms of the way that he presents some of these characters. But Shakespeare's making that link between James and Banquo there in order to increase the appeal of the play, perhaps, to James. And of course, that's one of the reasons why he has to present Banquo in a much more positive light than Macbeth within the play itself, whereas in history that wasn't necessarily the case at all. There's a couple of really good pages on the British Library website, where if you want to look more at the way that the witches were portrayed, particularly in Act 1, Scene 1, and those links to King James and the kind of the social, cultural and historical context of the time, then they're really good places to look.